Hello and welcome to a Talmud Israeli production. Today we will review the highlights of this week's course of Daf Yomi study, Masechet Shabbat, pages 114 through 120. Kuf Yud Daled, 114. Ezehu Talmid Chacham Shemimaninoto Parnas al Hatzibur. What is the type of Torah scholar that we should appoint as a leader over the community? Zeh Sheshoalinoto Dvar Halacha B'chol Makom V'Omer. It's a person who is capable of answering a halacha question on almost any topic, even the topic not currently under discussion, va'afilu Masechet Kaala, and even a question concerning Tractate Kaala, which happens to be a tractate concerning the Jewish wedding ceremony. Rashi explains why specifically Kaala is mentioned here. The lo regili ba inshiv is anatani bova garsa, because Tractate Kaala is not typically studied, and yet this person, this scholar, went out of his way to be proficient in a lesser-known matter. Tractate Kaala is among the Masechtot Ktanot, the minor tractates that are printed in the Babylonian Talmud, the Vilna Shas, after volume 17, following Masechet Avodah Zarah. And it is not very commonly studied, but a Talmid Chacham should know the material. 115, Kuf Tedvav. Tanu Rabbanan, Habrachot va'kamein afal pi shbesh behen otiot shel Shem, uminyanot shel harbe Shabbat Torah, kameyas, amulets, and the text of blessings, even though they have God's name in them, and many Torah concepts in them, we do not save them from a fire on the Sabbath. Rather, they'll burn up in the place where they're located. Even the divine names contained in these blessings and kameyas, amulets, nonetheless are burned up in the fire. Mikan amru, from here they said, the sages, those who write down blessings, who write down the liturgy on paper, kisarfei Torah, it is as though they burn the Torah. This may come as a bit of a surprise. After all, today we use printed sidurim every day. Well, that was true back then, that if you wrote down brachot, it's like you burned the Torah, because back then it was forbidden to write down the oral law. The Torah shebe'al peh could not be written down, and so any oral law material which was written down was allowed to burn in its place on the Sabbath. However, today that the rules of writing down the oral Torah have been relaxed, the Siddur is a legitimate book, and therefore the Siddur would be saved if in danger of being burned from a fire on Shabbat. Kuf Tet Zayin, 116. Bin Nahardai Paskis Sidra Diktuvim B'Menchata Deshabda. In Naharda, the Babylonian city Naharda, it was customary to have a Haftorah taken from the books of the Ketuvim, the third section of the Tanakh, on Shabbat afternoon. The Mishnah does not teach this. The Mishnah, in fact, says that there are books of the Bible that are not read, which the Gemara interprets to mean the books of the Ketuvim, because in fact, whereas the Chumash is read every Shabbat morning, and the Haftorah is read from the Nevi'im every Shabbat morning, the Ketuvim is simply not read as part of the synagogue. However, in the Amoraic tradition in Babylonia, in certain places, they did have this Ketuvim reading every Saturday afternoon. Kuf Yud Zayin, 117. Rabbi Ami v'Rabbi Asi ki miklahu rifta be'eruva sharulai. When Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi had the Eruv Chatzerot food item in their possession, this was a food item that was collected from the community to effect an Eruv Chatzerot. When they possessed that food item, they would use it to break bread on the Shabbat, on Shabbat. Why? They said to themselves, since one mitzvah, the making of the Eruv, was done over this bread, let us do another mitzvah of breaking bread, of making the blessing of Hamotzi Lechem min haaretz over the Sabbath meal. Commonly, in modern times, the food for the Eruv Chatzerot is not fresh bread, but rather is a box of matzah that is held for an entire year and only replaced around Pesach time. Kuf Yudchet, 118. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, mitzvah yitpalel im dimdumei chama. It is a mitzvah, it is a worthy thing to say your prayers im dimdumei chama when the sun is near the horizon. In other words, that you say shacharit shortly after the ball of the sun comes over the horizon, and you say mincha shortly before the ball of the sun dips below the horizon. So near sunset and near sunrise. what are the disadvantages of doing this? Well, the advantage is that you say your prayers at a moment when the day is beginning and ending, and you feel the rays of the sun upon you, and there is a special aura at that moment of the setting of the sun or the rising of the sun. However, the halachic problems are twofold. One, there is the possibility that if you call mincha for just before sunset and the minyan is late in arriving, you might end up davening after the official time, after the allotted time has expired. And secondly, if you daven mincha just before sunset, the temptation is to daven Mariv shortly after sunset, but then one will be reciting the Shema before the official time for the recitation of the Shema, which will require a further recitation when one gets home later after the darkness after 3 stars. Kuf Yutet, 119. Le'olam yasader adam shulchano b'motzei Shabbat. A person should always set their table on Saturday night after the Sabbath, even though you only need to eat an olive's bulk of food. This is referring to the meal called Malava Malka, that we escort out the Sabbath queen with some festive meal on Saturday night. This requires that the table be set in a dignified fashion. Now, it might be the case that your person is not very hungry because they ate a lot of food on Shabbos over the course of the various 3 meals, the Shalosh Seudot, and they only want to have an aloes bulk, a kazait, as part of the Malava Malka meal. But even if that's all they're going to have, nonetheless, they should set the table in a dignified fashion. Kuf Chaf, 120. Tanya, Shem Katuv Lo Al B'Saro. What happens if a person has the name of God written on his skin? You shouldn't bathe. Why? Because by bathing you will erase the name of God, and erasing God's name is a forbidden act. And you shouldn't anoint with oil, because again it'll smear God's name and it'll erase it. And you should not stand in a repulsive area, because we're not supposed to have God's name treated disrespectfully, and standing in an area of excrement with God's name on your person would be wrong. What happens if this individual who has God's name written on his person needs to go to the mikveh to do a required immersion? What do you do? So the Tanakama says, tie a reed around the spot of your skin where God's name is written and immerse, because hopefully the reed will protect God's name from erasure. However, Rabbi Yossi says, Tovel kedarko, you can go right into the waters, provided you don't rub the skin. So if God's name is erased inadvertently or accidentally or by circumstance, so be it. However, you should not do it aggressively and willfully